Hello everybody, welcome to this premiere episode of Lucie Reads Art of War, in which, as the title suggests, I'm Lucie and I'm going to read you from the massive sequel, 600 page long sequel to Sins of the Father, Art of War. It is broken up into two parts and we're starting with part one, which is called Hell Hath No Fury. Yeah, I just wanted to talk about the book a little bit before I got into it. Sins of the Father was released in 2017, I believe, or maybe late 2016. And from that, after I released that, I pretty much immediately went straight into writing the sequel, and it flowed so quickly that I wrote it in about 3 months. And I immediately wanted to get it out there as soon as possible. So when it came to editing it, I did a little bit of a hack job of it, to be honest. It was big. It was big right off the start, and I thought, oh, this is far too long, so I'm going to chop it down. And in doing so, I lost a lot of the voice of the story, to the point where when people read it, one of the criticisms was that it felt like a book from a different series, or a completely different book to the first book. Like it didn't, the styles didn't quite match up. I'd lost the voice on it, and that, as well with a few pretty tough criticisms to take on some of the ways that I portrayed what Martha does and the choices that she made in the book. I realised that I'd done the characters a disservice, and that was really hard for me to take, and I stepped away from it for a big while. I went back to it sort of the beginning of last year, around this time last year, and I sat down and I was like, right, I need to get on with this, because I love the characters. I still hear them in my head going, what the hell are you doing with us, Lucie? We're just sat here, you know, come on, do something. And yeah, so I sat down with it and I took a look at it again, and I improved upon it. I went sort of back to my original version and I expanded some parts of it. There are sort of 4 characters' perspectives in this story, and I gave them a lot more time on the page than I did before, fleshing out what happens with them, so that things that happen with them, it becomes more understandable about the way that they handle it, and also giving more time to Martha's story and the personal parts of Martha's story, which I think I kind of rushed through the first time. So yeah, I don't want to spoil things, so I was just trying to give a bit of backstory to it. This book has been such a labour of love for me, and yeah, I got it out again, and I messed up a little bit. Well, I messed up a little bit on the editing again. There was a few mistakes, and they were like typos. That it was that kind of thing. That knocked my confidence a tiny little bit. So I haven't really touched this book since the beginning of the year, when I sort of pulled it off, because I wanted to improve it and make sure that it was up to the standard that it deserves to be at. And now I've got my wonderful husband editing it for me, and I am working through the edits, and I'm going to be reading the book out to you to push me forward, and then when I get to the end of it, I should hopefully be able to continue and get out of my little creative rut that I've been in. I think it's already, from reading the first book, it's doing the job that's intended, because the characters are very loud in my head again. They want to move on. They want me to move on with the damn story. So yes, without further ado, we are going to move forward with yes, book 1. Just as I say, this is an author copy, so ignore the strip on the thing. That is the cover with the little side title. I'm going to do something that I didn't do at the beginning of the first read through, and that's, I'm going to read the blurb off the back of the book, so you got an idea of what to expect in this story. If you can remember correctly, Sins of the Father dealt with sort of Martha's quite personal journey, going back to Marytown and helping out her family who were in trouble, and in doing so she killed a demon that basically had murdered her stepfather and caused a lot of pain and heartache for her family. So yeah, this pretty much picks up where that left off. If hell hath no fury like a woman scorned, Imagine the path of vengeance an abused practitioner of magic was capable of walking. The wrath of a powerful witch, armed with something a hell of a lot deadlier than magic. That monster was going to pay dearly for his manipulation, for his abuse, for making her feel weak and afraid, for his corruption. Odds the female Nephilim wasn't sure would unnerve the demon, but would be his undoing. Hell's fury had met his match. She only prayed that no innocents got caught in the crossfire. When Martha Valentine returned to Marytown, her motives were deeply personal. Now she's been assigned the duty of liberating the town from the demons who still corrupt it. Working alongside the Marytown Paranormal Investigation Agency, Martha investigates the murder of the witch that sold her magic to William Ford, the stepfather she reviled, and the man whose death she avenged. Rebecca Patterson was a lost soul, lonely and troubled. Searching her home leads the team into a battle they're unprepared for, places somebody Martha loves in peril. But is the undead witch the only threat that Martha and her allies now face? It's getting bloodier in Marytown. Okay, so that's the blurb. I just wanted to put that out there as we're starting off. And yeah, I'm going to jump right in. I have an idea of what I want to read today. It's going to take a little while because the chapters are quite big and there's a few chapters that I want to get through. As I said, there are 4 characters' perspectives throughout this book, and I want to basically introduce the first chapters that deal with the first 2 perspectives, one of which is Martha. But before we get to Martha, chapter 1. Aya, the demon of wrath, was going to hell. Literally, he had been summoned there. His master, the universally reviled Dark King, didn't call as often as he might have done once upon a nightmare, but when the summons came, loud and as subtle as a sledgehammer knocking against the inside of a rancorous daemon's skull, it was impossible to ignore. Nobody disobeyed the Lord of the Underworld without punishment, not even the King's loyal executioner. Don't misunderstand, Aya didn't particularly like the Dark King. He didn't particularly like anybody. The loyalty he demonstrated for his master had never been about emotion, for he had no such need for attachment, nor had he ever felt the desire to eternally shackle himself to another being. He simply respected the chain of command, the sovereignty of the Dark King. It could, he supposed, be said that he admired the male. Impossible not to when one considered all the things the king had done for their kind. All of those well-documented ghastly and sinful accomplishments. The Dark King was a legend, a myth used to scare impressionable humans into adhering to the pretty little lies of a dogma that made them promises it could never possibly fulfill. A fallacious creed which told them that if they remained virtuous and meek, they'd be spared the torment bestowed on those who dared to misbehave, on those that dared to sin. Naive wretches. The devil who opposed their so-called God knew no such mercy. He didn't care who they were or how well they'd lived their lives. He only cared about power, domination, and how far his influence reached. If humans were foolish enough to insert themselves into his most violent schemes, they would die, swiftly, horribly, violently, and his many sycophantic minions would feast upon their souls, gorging until there was nothing left. It was that simple. Nobody survived the king's violence. The demon of wrath was the beast who carried out the regal monster's executions, his bloodying fist of violence and vengeance, the living epitome of his master's terrible reach. He was also the vessel that transported the condemned down through the splinters within the mortal realm to their place of reckoning. He knew damn well that as far as his master was concerned, if you were not with them, you stood against them. This was a zero-sum game rigged from the start. If you played it, you lost, with an eternity to pay the price. The realm of the Dark King was a terrible place, but to the demon known as Wrath and a select few others of his kind, it was home. A deep cavernous series of craters and fissures, violently blasted into the ashen depths of the world below. The royal palace stood, an imposing, decadent bastion of corruption, overlooking the king's vast pits, a sinister, brutal place where hell's lowliest and most abased creatures roamed unfettered. As the demon of wrath turned his head to admire the dank view from the narrow ridge he walked, one such creature scuttled up the sheer side of a barren cliff, ravenously racing towards a freshly fallen and abjectly terrified soul, as if it was starved and hadn't feasted for an age, which in the pits was also always a possibility. Life there was harsh, but fair. The demon watched on as the gangly fiend staked a claim on the soul, clasping hold of it with its gnarled, festering hands, and dragged it away, screeching and clamouring in terror down to its lair, hidden somewhere amongst the fire-scorched rocks. Unfortunate. That particular critter wasn't well known for being friendly. But the soul deserved whatever foul torture it had coming. Being cast into the pits was a punishment worthy of only the most wicked. It was a lesson in survival at its most base and brutal. Whoever the fallen soul had been in life, it no longer mattered. Down in the bowels of the Dark King's realm, it would be twisted beyond recognition, and from its inevitable demise would emerge a new creature, one that would pass the same violent lessons on to the next. The demon of wrath felt absolutely no pity for what such a soul would endure. If it could barely stand the heat, maybe it shouldn't have burned down the kitchen when it had been alive. Moving dispassionately onwards, he continued to climb up the mountain pass towards the palace. The steps he traversed were jagged and perilous, the rise steep and punishing. But he knew precisely where to tread, had walked the harsh, dangerous incline many times before. There were few weapons in the Dark King's arsenal as violent and unrelenting as wrath. Fewer still that had been given the freedom to leave hell and spread the king's vengeance across the mortal realm, in whatever manner they chose. He had privilege that many demons would slaughter for, but nobody gained an audience with the Dark King without first walking the same arduous path. Not even if he'd been summoned. Contrary to the name bestowed upon it, the towering stone edifice of the Dark Palace was not nearly as intimidating or ominous as it wanted to be. Its walls shimmered with an alluring pale blue illumination, the interior marble gleaming in reverence to its own perfection. The whole estate was a beacon, baiting the mortal realm to dare suggest that the king find shelter within a barren hovel, untouched by the splendour that he had once brandished in the service of their so-called heaven, revered as their brightest, most beautiful, their illustrious morning star, an angel upon most high. No, the male that had fallen from grace had never relinquished the side of himself that believed he deserved more than he'd been granted. The Dark King carried his unforgivable sin as a badge of honour, used it to fuel his rise from the depths of perdition to his sovereignty as king of the underworlds. His ego was incandescent, and he'd pridefully painted the walls of his home with his magnificent glow for all to see, to fear. The entity that the Dark King had once been was long gone. It's suddenly gone very dark in here. Sorry. It's like a cloud went over the sun. Spooky. Kind of distracted me. Hang on. The entity that the Dark King had once been was long gone. In his place stood a male that he knew deserved more, deserved to exist and be the true rightful monarch of the mortal realm should follow instead. His rise back up from the ashen depths was inevitable, for there could be no heaven without hell, no light without dark. The male who once danced in the heavens at the right-hand side of grace refused to be cast aside and forgotten, refused to go quietly into insignificance. He had known his worth, and he'd ruled his realm, forged his children, set out to correct the injustices lavished on him from the splendour of his palatial prison, arrogantly spitting in the face of the one who'd shunned him long ago, with continued defiance and a flat-out refusal to concede. Admirable, Wrath conceded, though he didn't share his king's fondness for the dramatic. It was too ostentatious, too showy, too blatantly proud. Finally reaching the apex, the demon of wrath approached the palace, numbed to the point of boredom by its splendour. Not breaking stride, he penetrated the inner sanctum, a set of wide and gigantically pillared doors as if he owned the place. He did not, of course. He never would. Hell already had one very worthy leader, and in spite of what the minions of the underworld might murmur to themselves in the darkest recesses of the realm, malignant gossip about his origins, it needed no other. It didn't matter where he came from, it never would. The demon of wrath had never craved more power than he'd already amassed. He served his king for one reason only, because he wanted to, because he was loyal. Those seeking a changing of the guard could look elsewhere. He wasn't interested in heralding any goddamn coup. Knowing this, the king's imperial protectors, a stern regiment of demons as posing and soulless as blackened medieval knights, who would lay down their very existence to protect their monarch, didn't react to his infiltration. The demon of wrath had been summoned, but even if he hadn't, he was more than welcome at court. expected even. Though the guards appreciated the undeniable potential threat to their well-being he posed, they would never risk pissing off not only him but their true master. Compared to even Wrath's ferocious standards, the Dark King was a male to be feared, if not only for his physicality. Standing taller than any demon within his impressive ranks, he was heavily set, with a power that coiled through his entire body, barely restrained. His was a vessel perfectly sculpted for the art of war by his formerly loving creator, though it was now more likely to be found fancifully dressed up in court finery than geared for battle. Not that a lack of active participation had ever dampened the male's threat. Nobody down below had forgotten what the Dark King was capable of. He was myth made real, terror incarnate. The Dark King didn't fear the deadly snake that he repeatedly invited to slither into his palace, for he created the serpent and had shaped it in his image, rather like his treacherous maker before him. Only the Dark King had thus far refused to spurn his creation out of jealousy, or a fear of being overshadowed by his protege. He trusted his offspring, and that trust was rewarded with his very own cold-blooded ambush predator, a contract killer who could go where the Dark King could no longer trespass, commit atrocities that the immortal realm needed to be reminded could be bestowed upon them once in a while. A deadly strike of wrath to beat the mortal sins of the Creator out of his so-called beloved children, in a war that would be as ceaseless as it was pervasive, pride prevailing from his legendary fall to conquer the world, with the demon of Wrath as the vanguard of his army. If he was commanded to, Wrath would be willing to personally deliver the Dark King's vengeance directly up to the duplicitous heavens, kick their celestial doors right in and rid the world of their so-called morality. Problem was, he'd never been given such an order, and it wasn't his place to pass comment on his master's more strategic policies. Even it was pointless and frustrating to watch whatever long game the king envisioned play out. Wrath was aware that Hell's vast resources were not as rich or as accessible as they'd once been, that there were problems on their doorstep that needed to be taken care of before the king even seriously considered taking the fight directly to his enemies, obstacles to wholly decimate. Wasn't his place to pass comment on that either. Another reason why he rarely swung by to visit. If the palace itself was a rampant testimony to the Dark King's pride, the throne room was a wicked extra indulgence. Not waiting to be summoned in further, the demon of Wrath briskly approached the elevated soapbox from which his demonic master held court, a sparkling glitter-edged pedestal in which the dark throne had been conceitedly positioned for years. Here, the king was a commanding presence, drawing attention from all who dare gaze upon him, a monarch of his own bloody making. Though his audience was limited to but one individual that day, the king remained as regal and imposing an image, worthy of the title in the realm. The crown which rested on his head was an ancient construct of gold and white bone, forged from the remnants of his first hellish victory, the night when he finally became his own master, the capture of his future palace and the decimation of those who had previously called it home. His black robe was a mantle, hanging from his wide shoulders like a debauched Gothic nightmare, adorned with enormous and elaborate gold and bone pauldrons. A stark mane of plentiful golden blonde and black hair framed his upper body like a tribal headdress, handcrafted from a virile lion's mane. Only it was real. It was all his. A head full of hair that might make any female swoon, had they lacked the self-preservation to know that such beauty was a mask for the brutal power that the male carried inside of him. A beast as nasty yet alluring as the wild animal he long coveted. King of all beasts, leader of all brats. His whole demeanour screamed his dominance, marking him as a figure to be feared if not entirely loved. The demon of Wrath had always held a healthy respect for the power that his master could and would willingly wield against those who enraged him, and he could always appreciate the purity of a gore-soaked and clenched fist, particularly when it was used against those who'd asked for the beating. Retribution was his speciality, after all. The thing that gave him pause on that particular visit had nothing to do with the king's appearance nor his demeanour, but a macabre oddity which appeared to be accompanying him. As sadistic as the master of demonkind could be, he'd never shown the disturbing inclination to start playing with his guests after they were dead, and no longer suffering for his enjoyment. So the demon of wrath felt that it was safe to assume the reason that he'd been summoned. A severed head nestled upon the king's knee, being petted like some ghoulish, bloodied lapdog. Not something a demon saw every day, not even in the dark court. The king's domineering, deep voice immediately confirmed at least some of Wrath's suspicions, melancholically lamenting, "Lucie is dead," which explained the intimate manner in which the still intimidating male was caressing the head's short, thick crop of dark hair like it belonged to a cherished pet, a heavy shadow furrowing his brow, because it had. Somebody executed him, which was what the brutal act of decapitation tended to imply. The demon of wrath didn't respond verbally to the surprising grim news, for there was little point. It wasn't his job to console the king. The male had plenty little sycophantic little demons hanging off his robes, clamouring and stepping over each other to do that dirty job. And if he were honest, he'd never much liked the owner of that freshly festering head anyway. Didn't mean a damn thing to him if the slick bastard had gone and gotten it hacked off. Austin Lucie was dead. Big fucking deal. The Dark Court was a dangerous place to live. Death was rife, utilised as a political tool as often as a pleasurable way to pass the time, a way of deciding who was worthy to serve the Dark King and who was ill-suited to the most dangerous place in the realm. Surviving in the court was game, deadly to those who didn't willingly play it, harsh to those who would normally relish in such an environment. But the brutality of it was normal, expected. All of the demon of wrath felt was a faint twinge of anticipation for what would inevitably come next. The order to retaliate. A name, a place. Didn't take much to get him started. Tossed through the divide, the king levelled his voice, switching out any earlier emotional undertones in favour of professionalism, as if he could sense his protege's lack of personal interest. Wise. He had to have known that he was never going to be able to appeal to Wrath's caring nature. He didn't have one. And there'd never been any love lost between his chosen executioner and any of the demons within their brethren. He had been created that way, forged from a fire unlike any other. Easier to rip the heart from a chest you felt apathetic about after all. Lucie was in the mortal realm, following up an interesting lead that had been brought to my attention. It was meant to be a brief excursion, there and back again, quick, painless, not the end. As the king ruefully shook his head, the demon of wrath remained passive, still emotionless, unmoved, ungiving. Far be it for him to judge why the dead male had left the cushy bosom of his overlord to venture into the great wide world above. The mortal realm was as explicitly dangerous for a place as their kind as their own realm could be, particularly for those who thought themselves invincible and underestimated the perils found within. Even further for it for him to judge the king over his decision to send somebody as woefully unsuitable as the Sir up there. Regrets like that would never ever be Wrath's burden to carry. Uncharacteristically sombre, the Dark King ran his long, heavily jewelled fingers through the locks of his decapitated pet and lamented. Do you know how long it's been since I punished someone truly worthy? The demon who embodied that very action thought he might have a small inkling, given how it was likely him who'd been sent to do the deed. But again, he maintained his resolve, adhered to his silence. Wasn't interested in reminiscing about such exploits. The past stayed dead, if not always buried. No sense in digging it up. There were no ghosts haunting him. Too long, the male in charge continued predictably. Down here, time, it moves slowly, lazily. Confined to this place, I'm forced to find ways to amuse myself, as you well know. But the state of the mortal realm is never far from my mind, especially now, given how most humans are coping with the unprecedented levels of strife that they seem to be suffering. He paused, the corner of his mouth lifting in a smirk, as if he'd played some part in that strife. His hand halted, buried deep in the dark mop of hair as a petty air of arrogance crept back in and began to poison his words. Funny how everything is slowly unravelling before their eyes. Hilarious, though philosophy was forever far from Wrath's mind. As far as he could care, humanity was a plague that had sullied the mortal realm's colourful variety of beings for far too long, and it would only continue to fester until they all died off, or were expeditiously murdered to make room for their betters. A day that couldn't come soon enough, if you asked Wrath. He'd never understood the necessity of such creatures. Speaking of pointless organisms, the Dark King finally decided to directly ask his unimpressed demon kin a question, posing it in a way that was as callous as it was arrogant. You know who's long been using my divide to discard the salacious evidence of their kills, don't you, Wrath? Allowing all the hatred he felt for the sanctimonious creatures that his king described bristle from his throat, transforming his voice into a grunting bark of disgust. Wrath curtly responded with one word. Nephilim. That's right, Nephilim, his Dark King echoed, displaying an equal deep antipathy. They've been abusing it for centuries, tossing their refuse into my hallowed pits like they think it's some kind of communal dump built for their convenience, filling my caverns with the spoils of their war. An act of disrespect that I have, until now, decided to allow them the luxury of getting away with. This, however, the king lifted the severed head up by the hair, dangling it before his now angry, twisting face. This is a personal affront that cannot go unchallenged. He was mine, Wrath, one of my oldest and my very dearest, and they killed him and threw him away like he was nothing but trash. But he wasn't garbage, no, he was mine. He was mine. Yeah, he had been. Wrath silently dropped his head in a rare showing of respect. Not for the fallen lesser demon, who had indeed been one of the king's nearest and dearest, a prominent member of the Dark Court, but for the male who'd been left behind to mourn, for the one who'd been besmirched by the killing, for the one who was deeply wounded by the loss. Let's be realistic, that idiot Lucie had likely only travelled to the mortal realm because he'd been eager to try and please his master, and then he'd gone and gotten himself slaughtered by an enemy that he couldn't have possibly comprehended, let alone prepared for and completed against. Nephilim like to make themselves feel all moral and virtuous by hunting down the Dark King's brethren. Austin Lucie would have been the kind of lesser demon who would have been an easy and enthralling target. Wrath was unwilling to criticise them for taking his egotistical head. Smug bastard had probably brought it on himself anyway. Should have stayed in hell where he belonged. But he would see those responsible for the crime suffer nonetheless. Duty demanded as much. His master would demand as much. Cold-hearted and logical vengeance wouldn't cut it this time. Wrath knew that only the worst of punishments would send a message worthy of being heard, to assuage the guilt his monarch battled, the responsibility for sending his beloved to his untimely death. Only the intimate attentions of the Dark King's execution would match the king's fury for the loss that he had suffered. The demon of wrath would be unleashed, and he was perfectly okay with that. Might even enjoy the action, if his prey proved themselves worthy. Mammon's old stomping grounds. Wrath raised his face, snapped out of his musings, focused hard on that one word, that name, an utterance that he hadn't heard past the Dark King's lips for a very long time, yet it had a greater impact than anything that had come before or would come after. Clawing at his most demonic, deepest parts of his psyche, locking up his jaw and gripping hard within his chest. Pure and unadulterated hatred spiked inside of his blood. He felt every drop of it, like a gallon of fuel dumped on his internal burning fire. Nothing could ever drive him so quickly to readiness. Nothing else could ever likely match that rekindled flame. The Dark King laughed, a hefty booming guffaw which sent his proud head momentarily back in what seemed like his first true moment of pleasure in a long while. For he knew his mercurial subject well, knew that the demon he'd summoned had been utterly disinterested in everything that he'd been told up until that moment, that it had been dull, routine, barely worth his time, and yet he didn't seem to be in the least bit offended. Instead he chuckled. I thought that might pique your interest. Oh, it did. Wrath felt his pulse quicken. It definitely did. Yes, the king continued blithely, I sent my Austin there, to that rabid bitch's broken den. I sent him to her realm, into her world. Not to hunt her, of course, that would have been absurd, but because I heard a whisper. one that I could use to my advantage. And naturally I was intrigued. Naturally. But Wrath wasn't interested in the details. He just wanted to be sent on the mission that he'd long been denied, the hunt deemed too absurd for a whelp like Lucie to have undertaken. If the vapid demoness his kind had come to know as the betrayer had resurfaced, returning to the scene of her many and varied crimes, Wrath wanted to know why he hadn't been informed sooner. The grisly fate of that particular problem had been sealed long ago, sealed and swiftly promised to the one monster who'd take the most enjoyment in slitting her wide, ensuring she'd pay for every one of her sins. The Dark King didn't seem remotely inclined to pander to his growing impatience, however, promptly stating, "The Nephilim are making their move and have retaken the border surrounding her town. Predictable, you might think, given how long they've monitored the area, and all those pointless skirmishes they engage with in my underling's station there. I would ignore it, let them think they have the upper hand, but Azazel sent his very best. That favoured son and his whole entourage. Now they hold the border, the whole area, and they don't seem interested in letting it fall back into my hands." He paused, pondered out loud. Now why would they do such a thing? And why now? What is it that they're hiding? The demon of wrath didn't know, didn't care if he was honest. Still he allowed a noise of disgust to escape his lips in the show of mutual spite and frustration at his king's fresh plight. Fucking Nephilim. Always showing up where they weren't wanted and acting like they owned the place. Between the disrespect that they'd shown, callously murdering the king's envoy in cold blood and then tossing his freshly blooded corpse through the cursed rift that separated the realms, he was beginning to get a clearer picture. Sometimes a fragile situation needed a deft and precise touch. Other times it needed a wrecking ball to render it obsolete. It was clear to the demon of wrath what needed to happen next. Travel immediately to this town of the betrayer, the king instructed him, as if he needed to verbalise the order. Find those who are responsible for this continued insult upon my dominion, and enforce on them the harsh realities of the poor decisions that they have made. Furthermore, when you located the one who butchered my poor Austin, I want them restrained and brought to me directly. I have particular plans in mind for them. Fair enough, I conceded. Had to admit he kind of resented the idea that he wouldn't be the one to deal that particular killing blow, but he figured he would get whatever he needed from the exchange by dragging the person right through the divide and into the pits, kicking and screaming. As for the Nephilim, well, if the Dark King yearned for normality to be restored along that border, so be it. Azazel and his best were fun sport to kill. With a curt nod, Wrath declared, "Your will shall be done." The king waved him away with a casual waft from the back of one of his enormous hands. No need for further discussion, or hell forbid a sharing of condolences over the loss of a demon that only one of them gave a shit about. Wrath turned on his heavily booted feet and stomped his way back through the throne room towards the exit, raw with a newfound sense of purpose, the seed of something huge potentially planted and taking root within him. The drive that he experienced to see the king's favoured weasel avenged was merely a formality that he'd felt many times before and would undoubtedly feel again. That he would relish in the undertaking of his orders was also natural, simple biology, how he'd been built. Nothing unusual about any of that, no. This anticipation was about something else, something that made his fingertips itch, something he'd waited an extremely long time for. The disembodied head of Austin Lucie abruptly came sailing over Wrath's shoulder, striking a nearby pillar with a sickening, almost squelching thud. A patchy trail of blood streaked down the carved marble where it rolled off the column, landing perfectly in his path. Not the most subtle way to ask for a male to wait. Hell of a shot, though, he had to give his master that. Craning his head, he glanced back at the king, immediately noting that the embittered monarch had risen to his feet, now towering before his enormous throne, regal face twisting violently with the anger that he'd just about managed to restrain. A clear warning to anybody who might be wise enough to take it that once his business with the demon of wrath had been concluded, the malicious monarch would be seeking out some recompense and comfort for his acute loss. And rather like the critter in the pit, he wasn't that fond of cuddles, nor any of the kinder acts of intimacy. Wrath wasn't concerned about his own safety, however. The Dark King knew better than to ever dare attempt to raise his abusive hand against his own weapon of mass destruction and expect that bomb not to blow up in his face. To him, the incensed sovereign declared what felt like one hell of a blessing to his deepest and darkest urges. A kindred wish and a sacred nod. If you happen to uncover the whereabouts of my old playmate while you're down there, be a good male and seek her out for me. My gratitude if you manage to grab her by her scrawny little neck and drag her home would be of levels unprecedented. His resulting loud huff sounded like a disgruntled beast, brimming with the undercurrent of brutal power and malice. Oh, I do grow weary of waiting for her to surrender as she ought. Under his breath, Wrath also grumbled. About damn time. Restrain that resentment, the king snapped back, clearly able to hear the complaint. I've not forgotten the promise I made you. She'll get everything that she has coming for her. You'll get your share. Knowing that he'd crossed a line with his impetuous impulse, the demon of wrath again bowed his head, as he vehemently declared, "Be my pleasure, and the pleasure of all she has wronged." With that, the Dark King stalked across the throne room and out through the doors which led up to his ground balcony, a royal viewing platform which overlooked the cavernous pit below, likely to find himself a new pet. It was well known how avidly the king enjoyed the spectacles of his denizen horde and what they put on regularly for him, especially when they knew that he was watching. It was like the creatures in that vile abyss could sense when he was at his worst, and rushed from their dank hovels to writhe and fight and commit a whole host of terrible atrocities upon each other, in a bid to gain not only the honour of his attention but his potential favour, a chance to be elevated to his side. It was well known that if one proved themselves worthy, the king would pluck it from that hellhole on a whim and lift it to the confines of his palace, bestowing upon it the opportunity to please him further, an opportunity they all relished in taking. The chance happened so rarely nowadays that it seemed absurd to Wrath that they still vied so desperately for it. Personally, he only ever went down to the pits when he was in a particularly foul mood. In a particularly foul mood and wanted to kill a lot of things in a short time frame, and didn't want to have to worry about the consequences. Given how that happened a lot more often than a lowly pit critter being elevated to the king's court, you'd think that the pitiful things might learn a thing or two about that. But they never did. They just kept fighting, kept clawing to win. Admirable to some, the desperation sickened Wrath. However, for one of them, it might finally be their unlucky day. Glaring at his feet, the embittered demon scowled down at the bloodied, beaten up and barely recognisable face that had been Austin Lasser, a lesser demon that he'd known for a long time. A sycophant who'd been as shameless as the hordes in the abyss in his desperation to be close to the king, but one that had been present at court for as long as Wrath could remember, a prominent part of the Dark King's entourage, family in a roundabout way he supposed. A prince or lord or something as inanely fancy as that in life, it had taken Lasser an embarrassingly long time to ascend to his demonhood, more longer than most who survived the descent into hell and didn't immediately perish in the pits. He'd been weak, but influential. The reason for his eventual rise to power was the same as the ruler's motive for summoning the demon of wrath to his throne in the aftermath of his death. He was still somebody, and thus Austin Lasser had been revered, cherished. In his own twisted way, the Dark King had loved him. And those Nephilim bastards had not only taken the lesser demon's head, but undermined the demonic lord's stranglehold on an area they should have better left the fuck alone. Whatever history wanted to dictate, that place, that town, was not theirs to claim. It never had been, and it never would be. Time to show them who was in charge. At least the fallen demon had one thing going for him, though, the demon of wrath supposed. A master who honoured the loyalty of those he revered in death with one of his greatest gifts he could have ever offered to them. The brutal attentions of his executioner. A punishment to fit the awful crime. The demon of wrath would see the male avenged, for that was his duty. It was what he'd been created and built for. As he left the dark palace, he collected the pitifully discarded head from the marbled ground, because you never know when such a thing might come in handy, and carried it with him on his trek back down alongside the pits, which had well and truly come to life like a seething, angry horde on the eve before a great battle, riled up, ready to go. The air now smelled of violence. As the mayhem began to unfurl around him, Ralph felt a lot like how he imagined his king had been feeling. Disgusted, angry, besmirched, in the mood for blood. He didn't linger to watch, however. This show was not for him, and he had somewhere to be, important matters to attend to. So with a renewed sense of purpose, he obeyed the directions of his king. He would travel to the town that had once been named for the one that his wrath truly hungered for. He would swiftly locate the one responsible for the Dark King's pain and deliver them to their reckoning so that they could serve as a headline act to the performance that his master was bound to still be enjoying when he returned. A finale befitting the great and wondrous plans that the male had for revenge. Brutality in its most beautiful form, served bloody hot. Once that action was swiftly taken care of, the demon of wrath would then return to the accursed place, restore the balance of power there, rid that bastard Azazel of his most precious sons, and eliminate any who stood between him and the one that he wanted to get his hands on more than any other. The betrayer. Her time was almost over. Exile almost rescinded. She, like the fools responsible for the death of Austin Lasser, had been marked for death, and so much worse. A need spawned deep inside of her impending killer, a yearning that he hadn't felt for an eternity. This act of vengeance had been centuries in the making. Retribution would be his to personally deliver. Aya, the demon of wrath, was going from one hell to another, and he had something very specific in mind. He felt excited, primal, unrestrained. He wanted what was owed to him, and pride would have no mercy for anyone who got in his way. Okay, it's a long opening chapter. 40 minutes that was. Yeah. That was not Martha's perspective. That was something. A couple of lines in there that made me chuckle. I can't help it. He's a bastard. But he has a way. Carrying on. Chapter 2. Viewing a dead body was one of those things that should have been done on a good night's sleep. Anyone who's ever experienced the misfortune would probably tell you that death by its nature is hard-hearted, however. Comes calling when it wishes, occasionally offering a helping hand in its passing, but it doesn't give a damn about the delicate sensibilities of those it leaves behind. It was the end of October, the sunset of autumn, edging closer to the time when the nights rolled in early and encroached further into the dawn's awakening than seems polite. The morning air was decidedly chillier than it had been days earlier, and a galvanising gust of wind caused Martha Valentine to huddle as best as she could into her short dark leather jacket, grateful that she at least had had the sense to wear a fitted hooded sweatshirt underneath it. Standing on the wide verge overlooking the summit of Blackthorn Hill, she was thankful for the blustery morning's ability to displace the most cloying of her mental cobwebs, but she would have preferred to have been operating on a good night's sleep. Trying to reclaim a small part of the life that had once been stolen for her was proving tougher than she'd envisioned when she decided to remain in Marytown for the foreseeable future. Effectively now living two lives, working two different jobs, was tiring. Balancing 24-hour day-night shifts, shadowing the extremely talented team of paranormal investigators at Empire, and finding the time to spend with her sister, who was still desperately mourning their recent familial losses, was tricky at best. Not to mention the key role that she'd been trained to play in the otherworldly battle that was constantly on the periphery of her awareness. Life was moving forward, and she was adapting to a new version of normal, but it was hard to say she was making progress. Marytown was a carefully constructed lie, with links to the occult that were as deep and twisted as they'd been when the town's foundation had been forged. Many who lived in the picturesque Cheshire region worshipped the darkness that lingered beneath the surface, infesting it as much with the vile voracity of human greed as it had the monsters who gleefully feasted upon such a sin. In spite of everything that had been done over the years to maintain the balance, the corruption had not only returned to the area, but it was thriving once again, and people were suffering the consequences. Innocent people like her sister whose lives had been casually decimated by the darkness. Nowhere was the depraved perversion quite as rampant as in the wooded hills that surrounded Marytown. Martha could sense it almost all of the time, the awareness making the fine hairs upon her arms stand to attention, a sensation she couldn't assuage no matter where she went or what she did to try and make the perception wane. Once the serene veil of ignorance had been torn away from her eyes, the undulating hills and quaint homes that dotted the landscape of her hometown had lost their lustre, revealed to her the truth. The energy that lurked beneath the surface and the monsters who lingered in the shadows on the edges of the town, forever waiting for their moment to strike and destroy. She could feel them all, chilling in their degeneracy. Martha would never forget the day that she'd stood so close to where she was standing now, and had been shown just how fragile the balance of power surrounding the town was. It was almost impossible for her to now imagine a time when she'd enjoyed rambling through these hills, full of tomboyish glee with her reluctant mother, her oafish stepfather and her bouncy little sister in delighted tow. How naive she'd been back then, how utterly clueless. Fitting it should be on the very same pinnacle of the very same hill that this body had been returned to her, at a time when her awareness was about as sharp as it was ever likely to become. A strange sort of coincidence that didn't make her feel remotely comfortable, almost like it had been planned. Little more than heath, the summit of Blackthorn Hill was like a barren wasteland, unlike the other lush hills within the area. Tree-covered mounds undulated in every possible direction from this one rather chilling focal point. The dawn sky was starting to clear up, the early rays of muted sunshine like a beacon, cast into the gloom of a murky sea, with even murkier secrets hidden deep within the fathoms, right down to the very bottom. Martha wasn't there seeking what lurked where the light refused to touch, however, not that morning. What she'd been brought to witness was out in the open, bold and brassy as the last time they'd crossed paths, dressed in the dirty, dishevelled remnants of what used to be a flashy business suit and a pretentious tie, a resurrected memory that should have stayed buried, only it had returned from the grave, or the very depths of hell itself. A gathering of human police officers and forensic personnel were busily milling around and inside of the brightly cordoned off crime scene, a sight that would have been reassuring if unnerving for most people. To Martha, and likely the male who stood beside her, the situation was an inconvenience at best, a fundamental failure of the most basic procedures at worst. Shaking her head, she muttered, "This is not good." Stephen North responded to her utterance in a clear yet hushed whisper, informing her, "My patrolling scouts came across the body during the early hours of the morning. Unfortunately, by the time I was informed of this situation, the human authorities had already been alerted and were making their way up the hillside. I determined it futile to engage or waylay them." Martha grimaced at his choice of phrasing, though she knew well that his Nephilim brothers, the venerated sons of Azazel, operated best outside the confines of human laws and interaction. While she had now been granted the permission to work alongside a very talented group of human paranormal investigators who resided in and around the Marytown area, she could confess that her fellow warriors' secrecy was a necessity. As adamant as she'd been in her desire to reclaim a place for herself within the mortal realm, Martha had no interest in drawing the attention of law enforcement, especially not when she was responsible for the body that they mysteriously now had at their feet. She really didn't need that kind of attention. Her mission was too vital. The demons are being lax in trying to reclaim the border, but they've not exactly been making this simple. Stephen's voice, as he continued to fill her in, was brimming with barely restrained frustration. No matter how he tried to mask it from her, Martha could hear its cadence lace his words, biting, harsh. She inquired, "In what way?" "There have been constant skirmishes," he said. "Nothing that an organised team cannot handle, but I've been concerned about the proximity to the trails that human ramblers use. We have set up magical deterrents throughout the hills to try and discourage traffic through certain areas, so that innocents do not become caught within the crossfire, but there will always be those who cannot or refuse to heed those warnings. It is an ongoing struggle." Humans were stubborn, Martha could attest to that. She wished that there was more Stephen and his brothers could do to limit the potential of human casualties, whilst they were whittling away at the seemingly never-ending supply of lesser demons that the Dark King kept sending to the area, other than to throw up some admittedly very powerful magical deterrents around the hillside, hope for the best and protect those who were unable or unwilling to protect themselves with danger. You could never eliminate the risks of human interaction when you operated in neighbouring quarters with people who were fully loaded with their God-given free will to go wherever the hell they wanted and not afraid to use it. Martha knew well the toll that being an inadvertent prisoner of war in the Nephilim's aegis campaign against the demon's hordes could have on an innocent person's soul. She carried the scars emotionally as well as physically all over her body. It made her visibly shudder to think that some unwary civilian could naively wander out into the hills, be used as bait to lure in the Nephilim warriors who guarded them into an ambush, or killed for sport, as a way of demoralising the Nephilim warriors. This was war. The Blackthorn Hills were part of the battleground. Martha didn't have to like it, but that didn't really change the reality. As heavily as she felt it in her heart, she knew that Stefan and his brothers would have been doing everything in their power to limit human casualties, and as far as she knew, nobody had died on their watch that hadn't implicitly deserved it. The body that was now on the ground was no innocent bystander, but it still posed a potential problem, one that could be devastating. Turning her head, Martha glanced up at her companion, disgruntled as he was with the current troubled state of affairs in his world. Stefan North had always cut an impressive figure wherever he stood. However, the short time they'd recently spent apart only served to emphasise to Martha how much taller and broader than an average human male he was, a living, breathing testament to why Nephilim warriors had long been considered to be giants. Over the passing millennia since they had begun to coexist and protect humans, evolution had kindly dictated that mortals were permitted to finally start catching up with the hybrid results of their daughters' illicit dalliances with the otherworldly beings that spawned the Nephilim. They still had quite a way to go. The impressive physical stature of a son of Azazel was still a lofty goal that even the most proficient human bodybuilder could ever hope to attain. Evolution did seem to carry a fondness for their kind, even if many of them still might reject the helping hand in favour of praising a god that had allegedly disavowed their existence and banished their kin. Being human-born, which meant that she was conceived and raised within the mortal realm, as opposed to the mystical sanctuary of the Mount, the home of the Nephilim and their angelic fathers, Martha was personally thankful for whatever genetic otherworldly assistance she'd gotten, even if she was limited by the experience. Wherever it come from, one of the perks of being the only known human-born, she supposed, huddling deeper into her jacket to ward off the cold, which she swore that she now felt in her very bones. As the weather had started to turn, Stefan appeared to have also taken to wearing a bulky military-style coat of dirty brown leather, as opposed to his lighter autumnal jacket, so it seemed like she wasn't the only one feeling the cold. That was nice to know, though he certainly wasn't bloody shivering like she was. The impressive outerwear he donned looked warm as well as functional, featuring many buckles, pockets, and a wide fur-lined hood which was tanned brown, a shade that offset the black of his tied-back hair, his heavy brow, and the scattering of facial hair that he had permitted to grow in over the recent weeks that they'd spent apart. Not an unusual occurrence when the leader of the Nephilim's military might was out in the field, stationed in the mortal realm for any extended period of time, but it was rare enough for Martha to notice, and assume that operations within the hills must have been keeping him very busy, or distracted enough to have let it grow so shabby. She had to admit, she'd always kind of liked him with a bit of scruff, thinking that it made him appear roguish and offset the broad, harsh facial features that he'd inherited from his father. Azazel, a fallen angel from an ancient order known as the Watchers of the Mount, the renowned watcher of the hunt, was not exactly what you would call a handsome man, but a brute of a male who selected the mothers of his potential sons based not upon their physical beauty, but on the attributes they possessed that would create tough and effective warriors. Saying that Martha had seen several portraits of Stefan's mother when she'd been alive, and she had been a beautiful woman, one of Azazel's few great loves, if the archives were to be believed. Knowing what she did of Watcher culture, Martha suspected that his deep affection for the woman had come from the fact that she provided him with many extremely talented sons rather than her looks or a supposedly kind yet fierce stubborn nature. But then she'd always been quite the cynic of Watchers and their old-fashioned roving ways. Like how it was and would always likely be a male-dominated society. and how female Nephilim such as herself were considered an impossibility. She was one of a kind. No others like her anywhere else in the world. Regardless of her disgruntlement about how dogmatic the culture she hailed from could be, Martha had always believed that Stephen could be considered a handsome male if he wasn't so stern and focused. She could easily count on one of her hands how rarely she'd seen him display any true sincerity of happiness. The hunt always came first. His sense of duty was everything to him, and he had very little time for being sentimental. Something that venturing out into the Blackthorn Hills was not helping. Stephen was feeling woefully frustrated by the challenges of the posting, much more than he felt proud to be the one leading this inevitable reckoning. Rife with dissatisfaction over how things had thus far played out, he wished that he could act more decisively, rather than wait and hold their ground. He wanted to be done with Marytown and all it represented, to be anywhere but there. These were emotions that Martha understood, if she were not able to fully empathise with. In the grand scheme of things, she was doing all right. Better than Stephen, it seemed. Acknowledging the controlled yet chaotic scene that was playing out on the hilltop before them, she fought to suppress the desire that she had to demand an explanation as to how on earth what she was witnessing had come to pass. How the body had been dumped back somewhere it didn't belong, or how come it had taken long enough for Stephen to be informed about it that the human police had already been alerted and were at the scene. But she didn't feel like she could, or more accurately that she should, dare question how the Sons of Azazel were operating past the Marytown border, where she had no real authority. This was not her turf, it was Stephen's. No matter how integral a part that she was played in making this incursion happen, it was not her place. When the two of them last parted ways following a difficult encounter during which Martha had struggled to contain her emotions and not bawl like a baby, giving up her comfort blanket, it had been clear how the dynamic between them might change. Stephen had always been her mentor, her companion for way over a decade. Then had come to what felt like an untimely end. While she was secretly stationed within the boundaries of Marytown, he and his brothers had secured the land which they had liberated around it, and had successfully held their ground. A mission that was as noble as Martha's own was personal, but now they lived apart, walked parallel yet separate paths. Days had melted into weeks, one week into another. Stephen hadn't called her, seeking any sort of assistance, and she'd refused to give in to her weaker moments to call him, seeking reassurance that she was still doing the right thing. She had made her choice, that she was doing the right thing, that she'd made the right choice, and that she shouldn't just go home. For the first time since they'd met, they were operating independently of each other, and that had mostly been fine for Martha, though she found herself missing the band of males that she'd come to know as closest kin, especially the stalwart warrior who was their leader, the favoured son. But then that morning something unforeseen happened. Stephen had finally reached out, and Martha's worlds had crashed abruptly into each other again, because what was laying out on the ground, being scientifically examined by the good police of the Cheshire Constabulary, was her responsibility. A stark and abruptly timed reminder that her presence in Marytown had real-world consequences that could be devastating, ultimately affecting so much more than her ability to go home, to reconnect with and reclaim her old life. Though she was technically mortal and able to pass as human, the reality was that Martha was the same as Stephen and his warrior kin. She was Nephilim, and the offspring of a human mother and a father that many considered to be a fallen angel, a watcher, and she was not supposed to even be in Marytown. Hence why Stephen and the Sons of Azazel had secured the border to mask her presence, control what was happening in the Blackthorn Hills. It could cause a hell of a lot of problems if their enemy decided that they were not willing to overlook her trespass, her wanton violation of the Pact, a peace treaty which had been drawn up centuries ago to prevent the eternal war between demons and their angelic nemesis from indiscriminately decimating the human populace of these lands, as it had done so once before. In theory, Martha understood the need for such an agreement, and the preventative measures that it extolled. In reality, the fact that she existed was living proof that it had been surreptitiously ignored for as long as it had been in effect, and that made her feel like it was only a matter of time before war was declared in the region once more, or restrictions dramatically cast aside. When Martha asked Stephen how bad things could become for the people of Marytown if the pact was ever revoked, he'd refused to answer, which should have been all she ever needed to know about the possible consequences. When she'd pleaded with Stephen to take her to the place of her birth, the love that she felt for a human family and her desire to make sure that they were safe had meant more to her than any possible negative consequences. But it was hard for her to definitively say that she'd made a wise choice, that she hadn't somehow made this worse. Martha knew that Stephen felt the same uncertainty, because he had from the start. She could sense it now as acutely as when she'd pleaded with him to help her. The otherworldly abilities bestowed on Martha by her biological father were strongly empathic, which in regular terms meant she tended to absorb raw emotions like a human sponge. If she didn't vigilantly protect herself, calling upon the robust psychic barriers that she'd developed over the past decade, she'd become unable to function, an emotional wreck in every sense. Even when protected, some emotions always manage to filter through, because there's no real way of avoiding them other than secluding herself somewhere remote, far away from anybody who might personally affect her. Tempting as that was at times, she'd already spent far too long ostracising herself from those she cared for, subjugating the emotional attachments that she felt to those around her. She needed to live a full life. Only Stephen had been the real notable exception to that rule. During the years they'd spent together, the metaphysical bond that they shared had grown to become something as deep as it had become meaningful. Though it was something they had originally entered into as a way to help Martha better assimilate with her angelic kind, it had developed in what many people had branded a relationship, though neither of them had ever considered it such. Their bond had many practical benefits, offsetting the empathic link that connected them. Yet Stephen had never truly acknowledged that he had metaphysically gained as much from Martha as she had from him. In the culture of the Nephilim warrior, it was highly admirable for Martha to have grown stronger, more skilled in combat, more self-assured in her role, taking the battle directly to their demon foes. These were attributes to be lauded, to be celebrated, traits which elevated a young human-born Nephilim quickly up the ranks so that she could stand at the side of Azazel's favourite son with merit, and know that she truly earned the right to be there. What Martha gained from their bonding was something to be proud of, and she was extremely proud of her accomplishments. However, as a contrast, it was considered somewhat taboo for a warrior like Stephen to have become more emotional, more caring, even though it had also in many ways made him just as successful, a better leader, a better male. It would never have been a problem if Martha had been Azazel's long-lost daughter, Stephen's half-sister. The traits they would have been able to share would have better complemented each other, and together they would have dominated the great hunt, sent even the most deadly of demons fleeing in terror whenever they showed up to engage them, a pairing so formidable it would have been considered legendary, written into the annals as great myth. As it stood, Martha had been sired not by the all-powerful master of the hunt, but by another fallen angel, Gadriel, the Watcher of Grace, an empath, a diplomat, a man of words and charm, one of influence rather than action. Acknowledging what she could sense of Stephen's struggles to adapt to his current situation would be a discourtesy that he didn't deserve, however curious her empathy might be, or how the situation developed. Ignoring what she could as best as she could, Martha quickly turned her attention back to the barren hilltop. She couldn't continue to be preoccupied with the mix of emotions that she was beginning to acutely sense the longer that she stood there staring at Stephen. His mood was none of her business. He hadn't called her so that she could check up on him and judge his emotional well-being. If she was feeling slightly more brazen, she might have opted to vault down off the ledge and physically infiltrate the cordoned-off area hidden by the Nephilim concealment spells that were still masking her and Stephen's proximity to the crime scene. But it had been a while since she'd undertaken anything that resembled a reconnaissance mission. She wasn't confident in her ability not to be detected by any of the humans at the scene, knowing that there could be those amongst them who might be perfectly adept at seeing through the mystical cloaking that she wore. It simply wasn't worth the risk. Just below the ledge on which they stood was a line of white and blue police tape that had been stretched out around the area in which the body lay. It bore a stark warning. Police line, do not cross. Which was fine, she wouldn't need to. Sealing her eyes to take a look, Martha relaxed her metaphysical barriers, an act that she was now so proficient at that it was merely an afterthought. In her mind's eye, she envisioned the protection as to be as delicate as a silken curtain to be mentally peeled away from her psyche. Simple to manipulate, when in reality her mental fortifications were as secure and robust as heavy industrial shuttering, a wall of steel that kept her sane. Her empathic sensitivity made it extremely possible that the moment she opened herself up, even a little, the results could be overwhelming, could be a disaster. She was always cautious, but no longer afraid of letting go. She knew that she controlled her power, that her empathy was nothing to be afraid of. It was not evil, a weapon to be abused by others to torture her. It was merely her nature, in her most basic and psychic form. That morning when she peeled back the silk curtain, she did so with extra care. There were several living souls in her vicinity, and a lot of people meant a lot of emotions. She was only interested in the life that had been expunged, its shell left discarded on the ground, and couldn't allow herself to become distracted by the emotions of the humans that were conducting the investigation. They were not her priority. She had to stay focused on her goal. As it was, one specific energy signature pinged immediately up on her empathic radar, a dominant force that seemed desperately to want her to pay attention to it, give it the attention that it believed it deserved, which was utterly understandable. The otherworldly power that Martha carried inside of her knew the male that was standing behind her, almost as well as she knew herself. Even though it had been over a decade since they'd been deliberately introduced to one another, her power still actively sought out his. Time didn't seem to matter. He was the complementing side of her metaphysical coin. Together they could find balance. Apart, it always felt like a part of her was searching to find him, even when he was standing right next to her. The temptation to take a closer peek at whatever was going on beneath Stefan's normally impenetrable surface was always going to be a prevalent battle to fight. After a decade, her empathy was still so stubbornly determined to uncover what was making him tick in the way he did, but for her own sake, Martha didn't want to feel any of his emotions. Not on that morning. Stefan had missed her, even though he'd been resigned to his duty and had taken a big step back, allowing her to choose her path and forge her future, to return to this cursed place, be with the humans that meant so much to her. As difficult as it has been letting her go, he didn't begrudge her the choice that she'd made. Despite her somewhat taxing nature, Stefan had taken a lot of pride in all that Martha had achieved. With his careful guidance, her confidence had grown, her endurance restored and improved upon. He'd been thrilled when she'd begun to display more Nephilim qualities, pushing past the limitations of being human-born, born in the mortal realm. In everything that Martha did, she made him proud, now and always. Being the catalyst for their mission to liberate the town in which she'd been born was the latest of her accomplishments, and he felt honoured to be assisting her in getting the task done, an act that had been a long time in the making. However, now with the discovery of the remains of a demon that she had executed within the border of that awful town, returned from damnation, he couldn't put his personal feelings aside. He was deeply worried about her, battled his innate need to protect her, to keep her safe from anything that might dare to... Stefan, Martha spoke out loud, eyes remaining sealed. I'm going to need you to take a step back, a physical one. There's no way that I can do this with you standing so close to me, not this morning. Back off a little, please. As if he hadn't realised that his presence may compromise her ability to metaphysically focus, Stefan made a noise that registered somewhere between surprise and disgruntlement. But he moved away from her, stepped back so that he was standing inside the tree line that they'd emerged from on entering the area. It was still physically close, relatively speaking, but Martha didn't exactly expect him to go and hide in the bushes just so she could concentrate. Mentally, she spoke a little thank you and proceeded to focus. Ahead, not on Stefan and his rising levels of anxiety. To help her focus, she got down on her haunches and laid a palm flat against the sandstone rock that they were standing on, a physical connection to the land that would help strengthen the psychic and empathic link that she was hoping to make. There were so many different life forces available to her to take a closer look at on the hillside. Other people, other humans, plenty for her overactive empathy to play about with, so she zeroed in, driving all her otherworldly attention to the one thing that she wanted to learn more about. The corpse which she'd been brought to see was laying on its back in the middle of a rocky patch of sandstone. like an ugly, unwanted blemish on the patchwork flank of a giraffe that was otherwise perfectly presentable. A faint, lingering essence betrayed the true nature of the fiend that had been slain, an energy signature that Martha would never have been able to mistake for something benevolent, even back when she'd barely been able to wield a dagger or harness her power. These were not human remains, after all. It was that of an enemy, one that had not only broken the terms of the pact as she had done, but callously murdered a human man by the name of William Ford, Martha's stepfather, the head of the household she'd grown up within, her mother's beloved husband, who also happened to be an arrogantly functional alcoholic who ruled his roost with equal measures of resentment and pomposity. A conflicted man, a bully, an abuser. But somebody whose death has affected Martha a lot more than she would have ever thought possible. Somebody that she'd mourned, even though she spent many nights in her youth wishing that something awful would happen to him. For in life he'd tormented her mercilessly. She'd grown up hating him with every fibre of her being, every ounce of her soul. Now he was gone, murdered by the monster that he had summoned in a desperate bid to make amends for his past and right the wrongs that he'd wrought on the child that he'd once resented, the daughter that he'd always known to not be his. It was perhaps ironic that his life had ended during his final attempted act of redemption. But Martha wasn't so much concerned about the karmic twists of destiny. She didn't care about the how or the why. Not anymore. Her thoughts were now with the enemy that had been responsible, the enemy that she had definitely slain. 3 weeks dead, but now back from the abyss. Monster's remains strewn across a hilltop for all to witness. It was no wonder that Stephen was so deeply affected by this discovery. The first thing Martha noticed about the grisly remains was how remarkably well preserved they appeared to be, given that it had been long enough since the demon's death that they should have been rotting away in the deepest pits of the hell that it spawned from. She recognised the clothing that the corpse still flaunted, a mental image of a flashy demon that it belonged to popping into her mind, and then finding itself quickly being cast out. The second and probably more important thing she noticed was that the remains were not intact. The murderous demon's greatest identifying feature, including the face that she'd happily pummeled into mulch, oddly appeared to be missing. It was not with the body. Nowhere to be seen. What happened to the head? She asked, speaking within her own mind. Stephen's voice resonated within the same mental space, as intimate an act of communication as if he was standing over her, whispering directly into her ear. It made her spine tingle even though his tone was bleak, as he thinly responded. Isaac insists that after he retrieved the slain demon from your family's home, he cast all of the body into the divide. Nothing of it remained in our possession. The head was seemingly not returned with the corpse. How could the body end up back here without it? That awful chasm has openings in the mortal world, but all threads lead back to one destination. Those harrowed pits of their master's realm. It is not much of a stretch to assume that the remains would have gotten scattered when they were discarded, the head misplaced. I would imagine that it's still down there, somewhere. There was a deliberate pause before he sternly added, I've never heard of something that's gone through the divide being sent back, particularly not with such obvious and planned precision. Are you sure the remains were discarded correctly? Martha asked, as it seemed a hell of a lot more likely that the demons intercepted the body before it was thoroughly disposed of, rather than them engaging in some twisted fetch and retrieval mission to claim it from the depths and return it back to who sent it. If Isaac says he cast the demon away, I have no cause or inclination to doubt his words, Stephen swiftly retorted, adding, and neither should you. Martha bristled at the tone he used, disliking that Stephen seemed to have a much deeper access to her psyche than she sometimes had of his. She didn't doubt the words of his fraternal kin, not exactly. Isaac was trustworthy and a very capable male. She was simply struggling to understand how any of this was possible, the logical paths in her mind not leading anywhere pleasant. Widening her mental scope further, Martha continued to scan the hilltop, trying to recall what few things she'd learned about the area as a child. Not much came easily to mind, which frustrated her. Local history had never been her passion, and it wasn't like the schools she attended educated their pupils on the inner workings of demons that may or may not have found the area irresistible. It It wasn't often she found herself regretting not paying much attention when her stepfather dragged her and her sister to the local art gallery to attempt to instill some artistic culture and history into both of them. Those lectures had only stuck for Amanda. Martha had just been bored. History was yesterday, it was behind them, who cared? Recently, however, Martha had met somebody who'd taken a mild and thinly veiled amusement in informing her that the area around Marytown had many links to pagan ritual and worship. She wasn't sure if she trusted the source of information as far as she could throw him, in spite of the close relationship that he had with her family, but it made a lot of sense and tied into what she'd come to learn about the demonic presences that made Blackthorn Hill such a hotspot for evil and death. The entire plateau before her buzzed with the same sort of dark energy that she'd long come to associate with the surrounding landscape. Corrupt and unpleasant, it prickled her skin, the sensation only intensifying further as her astute copper eyes scrutinised her surroundings. Elaborate etchings had been carved in some of the rocky sandstone surfaces. Bizarre figures like creepy, haphazardly drawn stickmen and runes, left over from a lifetime of ancient spells, seemed to glimmer all that brighter as she located them. Very old, deeply coded secrets she didn't have the magical knowledge to ever be able to interpret. Many different signatures of dark energy bled out from the ether, invisible to the naked eye of most who'd visit the location and think nothing of it, save to be enamoured by the natural splendour and the lovely view. Martha pinpointed and identified certain trails of energy, their essence the same as what she considered to be demonic and inherently evil, branching off all over the place, because demons like to cross this land a lot, likely that same day. Other signatures were strange, likely some form of ancient magic that had been lost to her age, even if she did have the talent to read them. This place had seen a lot of darkness in its many years. It had been witness to so much mystical, magical, demonic influence, that it remembered every bit of it. Shuddering in revulsion, Martha observed, "Demons are drawn here." "They are," Stephen responded, still grim. "Before we were able to secure the border, they would often gather on this hilltop in vast swells, congregating here night after night. The spot doesn't run along the border directly, nor is it particularly close to the divide, yet it still holds a significance to their kind, and I dare say they fought to keep control of this spot harder than the border themselves. For what purpose I would not like to try and even speculate." "Well, somebody chose to dump the body here on this hilltop," Martha pointed out, "because it seemed like such a strange place, such a strange thing to do, especially if the location was deemed sacred to demons, like a desecration of their sacred altar. Only their so-called king would have the ability to send remnants of a demon slain back through the divide, the authority to have it placed here for all to witness." Stephen seemed to sigh loudly in frustration, his response filled with a lot of disdain as he added, "It is a deliberate act, a reminder that we are treading along lines that have proven disastrous in the past. Perhaps a warning that our actions have not gone unnoticed. We have his attention, and he's prepared to respond. This is a vile, abhorrent message." "Aimed at me," Martha stated, rather than directly asked. Stephen didn't verbally respond to that, meaning that he either couldn't be sure whether their enemy knew that she was the one who'd slain the demon or not, and he didn't wish to directly blame her for what had transpired. Or he thought that she was being targeted, and he didn't wish to frighten her. Either way, Martha wasn't sure which option bothered her the most. For the reality was she'd worked through her initial shock over the brutality of her stepfather's death, and the overwhelming unexpected rush of grief that she'd experienced by furiously pummeling the arrogant demon that had killed him to death with her bare fists, long before she'd hewn the bastard's head from its shoulders. She'd taken pride and a satisfaction from the killing that unnerved her, because it was too personal. This time, for the first time in many years, she truly wanted a demon to die, to suffer at her hands. That fiend sealed its fate the moment that it took a human life. Stephen's voice spoke into her mind, as if she'd vocalised her train of thoughts, her worries, and had been seeking reassurance for what she'd done. She hadn't been, but it was a pleasant surprise. He'd never really been the comforting type. "I know," she replied softly, though she hung her head. Of course, she carried with her a fair share of regrets when it came to the man who made her childhood a misery, for all the hurt and the rejection, because the man she believed to be her father had hated her when he had so much love to offer to her mother and her baby sister. Regrets for all that might have been if only she'd known the truth, if She'd understood the reasons why she'd always been the black sheep in his pristine, happy flock. Martha regretted that she'd never been granted the chance to meet the man again before he died, to confront the abuse that he had subjected her to, so that they might have been able to bury their torrid past and find some peace. She regretted that his death had been the catalyst for her return to Marytown. Her sister, with her unrelenting grief and not any of the stark, desperate pleas that he had cast into the ether for her to hear, his longing to make amends, to bring her back to her family. She hadn't heard any of them, likely because she hadn't wanted to, and may well have blocked them out on purpose, she couldn't say. But she regretted the impact that his violent death had had on those that she loved but had left behind. Her mother Gail, rendered catatonic by the loss and knowledge that the same monsters who had once stolen her beloved daughter had wrenched away another soul that she loved, because of a deeply personal secret that she carried, a secret that caused so much loss and heartache. Her sister Amanda, to whom William Ford had been a doting and supportive parent, a sweet, blessedly naive young woman who discovered his body after witnessing his impending death in a telepathic vision that still haunted her to this day. Her grief had truly yet to wane. She was just so lost without it. The foundations of their family had irrevocably ruptured the night that William Ford had been killed. Martha felt the weight of the loss, and though she hadn't cried nearly as much as her sister had done, she regretted all the things that she could have done differently. But she never once regretted the actions that she took the night that his murderer had been slain. No, that monster had gotten everything that it had coming. She would never regret taking its head. Burying her emotions, she resigned herself to dealing with the unforeseen consequences. Keeping her empathic senses carefully ajar, Martha stretched her psychic reaches out so far that they brushed across the human people who had been summoned to Black Thornhill, simply so she could check how much they'd been able to discern from the headless body. Being on the terrifying Dark King's radar was potentially one thing. She didn't need to worry about having human law enforcement knocking on her door to ask questions she wasn't sure that she could answer. Not about this death. They simply wouldn't understand the grim reality of what she knew. Of all the personnel manning the crime scene, only 3 drew any notable interest to her. Maybe because she could feel the tension that existed between them, a thing that made her empathy tingle, intrigued like a curious, impish eavesdropper, wanting to live vicariously through their fraught and complex web of emotions. To be part of their world, even though it also viewed them as one might watch the interactions of wild animals caged up at the zoo. Their interactions were curious, exotic, their motivations a mystery. They looked friendly enough from afar, but they were unknown and somewhat frightening. Martha understood the appeal and the awe that they inspired, but unlike her inner curiosity, she had no desire to enter the domain and get to know them, because she was not one of them. She was an outsider, a threat they wouldn't have the ability to understand. Sadly, wasn't worth the risk, so she stayed on the periphery of their world and watched, vicariously experiencing how they interacted with each other. It was safer that way, for all of them. 2 of the parties, she noticed, appeared to be plainclothed officers, most likely detectives of some stripe, though Martha couldn't begin to guess their rank. Suffice to speculate that they appeared to be in charge, jointly coordinating with the technicians who were busy working the body in the surrounding area, seeking clues that she hoped they wouldn't find as to who had dumped it there. Far too dangerous for these humans to start hunting down demons. The older detective scowled at every person that dared to look in his general direction, let alone attempt to physically approach him and his partner, as they were huddled together engaging in what appeared to be a terse conversation. An air of acrid sullenness clouded the man like an aura of second-hand smoke, and though Martha couldn't make out what he was saying from where she was perched, she understood the emotions that were in his words. He was tense, angry. Martha would go as far as to suggest that he was personally disgusted. The focal point of his irritation curiously didn't seem to be the discovery of a headless corpse inside his jurisdiction, as one might imagine. No, there was someone present at the scene who he didn't like being there. Not his partner, a man who appeared to be at least 15 years his junior, a man that simply nodded compliantly as he listened to the bluster of grievances that he was being handed, occasionally rubbing a hand repeatedly over the neat dark blonde hair that covered his head. An utterly human gesture. One that reminded Martha of another human man, one that she knew very well. Latching onto the older detective's disdain, her eyes shifted and followed the direction in which the acrimony was being projected. surprised when a gaze landed upon a pretty female officer that had a rather striking auburn hair, standing on the other side of the hill from where the body lay. It had to be personal, but Martha couldn't initially work out why. The officer seemed nice enough, holding herself with confidence and a professionalism, so she was simply there to do her job and wanted to keep her head down, so she was perhaps unaware of the disapproval that was being thrown her way. Her demeanour was such a stark contrast to the older man who was opposed to her that on the surface it seemed strange, unwarranted, petty nonsense, not worth the effort. However, Martha noticed that the officer's shrewd eyes were locked onto the headless corpse as if it were talking to her, confessing its many sins and filing a very detailed report about the nasty female Nephilim who tricked it into being summoned, only to then chop off its head. Foul, cruel betrayal. And Martha found herself freezing, caught completely off guard, though it didn't seem the officer was aware that there were 2 extra otherworldly onlookers in her nearby vicinity, identifying her as being different, special. Power recognising latent power, potential sensing latent potential. This woman was metaphysically gifted in a way that Martha couldn't quite put her finger on. She wasn't empathic. Magic, perhaps. Perhaps just a very keen psychic talent. Either way, she stared intently at the headless demon, still lamenting on how awful the discovery was, not simply because the headless body has been dumped in the open like a piece of old garbage. She knew what she was looking at wasn't quite right, that it wasn't quite human, though she knew that nobody here would believe her if she verbally claimed such a thing. This place, these hills, disturbing every single inch of them. She hated being there as much as her presence was unwelcomed by those she worked with. Those bigoted arseholes didn't believe a freak like her should be working amongst them. Those who resented her for her abilities whilst overlooking the dedication and determination she constantly showed. It felt like people were never gonna let her get over her past. That they were forever gonna judge her, even when she had moved on. In that moment of revelation, Martha couldn't help but empathise with the officer. She knew what it was like to exist in an area filled with dark secrets when you weren't exactly normal, when you saw things that other people, who rather preferred to pretend that the whispers were just scary bedtime stories told only around a campfire in a darkened room on a dare. Martha knew what it was like to be alienated, ostracised, hated. Hang in there, she wanted to whisper down to the officer. It gets better. Drawing her attention back to the 2 detectives, Martha focused not only on the female officer's bully, but the younger detective who, hoping that he was more professional than his still scowling counterpart, could give her some insight into how their investigation was going. A small number of analytical details that she could pluck for his mind were very muddled and frankly rather boring, but it was good to see that he was mentally keeping track of the crime scene in chain of command while his colleague, a person who he seemed to actually quite admire, was ritualistically slating was being ritualistically slated into his reluctant ear. Whatever. He'd heard it all before, and he didn't agree with any of it. He knew the woman that was being besmirched better than the ignorant idiot standing by his shoulder did, better than most. Her insights were incredible, and she was bloody good at her job in spite of all the distrust that she received. He was looking forward to talking to her one-on-one later after all this wrapped up, to hear what she made of all this mess. He had her back, even if others surrounding them refused to. Martha found herself smiling, pleased that not everyone down there was as ignorant of what was going on around them, seeing echoes of something familiar, and reassured her that the female officer she had encountered wasn't completely alone. It was refreshing to learn that the human police had people working amongst them who were able to understand the horrible truth of the land that they served to protect, and were also somewhat vigilant of it. There were some good people down there, doing honest work. Martha didn't want to become an enemy of the human police, in spite of the rather awkward fact that she was technically the killer that they would now be seeking to apprehend for this grisly crime. Her mission in Marytown was to protect people just like them from the corruption that the demons actively encouraged, to liberate the area they worked in from the vilest influences, and ensure that no families like her own lost people they loved. She wasn't there to cause problems for them, and it made her feel a healthy dose of guilt that she'd gone and done exactly that, providing her enemies with a body of what appeared to be a human male that could potentially be attributed to her, used against her, a murder investigation that would make living in Marytown, fitting back into her human life, a lot more difficult than it already was. She'd already spent far too many years in the captivity of those who would destroy her life as easily as they could blink, She had no desire to spend any time at the pleasure of her birth country's majesty. Her mission was personal, and it was vital. She needed to be a part of the intended liberation of Marytown, to be there when the people that she cared about were finally set free and the demons had been driven away for good this time. But she knew she needed to be careful. Saddest part was that in many ways the human authorities were a lot like her, a lot like the people that she knew and worked alongside. They shared a common and worthy goal with the Nephilim who'd returned to the area to protect the innocent, to see those who crossed the lines of decency be punished for their trespasses. But she had no intention of becoming their friend, let alone their ally. It would be too risky to involve them now, too dangerous. If they were as good at their jobs as she hoped they were, it would be inevitable that their paths would cross and they could potentially become an issue too perilous to ignore, a risk to her mission and to themselves. But for now, Martha was more than happy to wish them on to keep out of their way and wish them the best of luck as they went. Operating in an area like Marytown and Blackthorn, they were going to likely need all the good fortune they could muster, because the monsters had shown how fiercely and how dirty they were willing to fight for what had already been taken from them. They didn't care if humans got caught in the crossfire. They didn't care who they had to hurt to make their point, trample over to reclaim what they'd lost. Martha would happily lay down her life to protect the human police officers who were investigating the remnants of a demon that she'd killed. That was her duty, the vow that she'd taken as an Nephilim. Sadly, she suspected, the feeling wasn't mutual. Ooh, okay, I'm realising how long these chapters actually are now. They really are quite long, much longer than in the last book. Arguably a lot of backstory in that one. And there was a third one that I wanted to read, so this part is actually going to be longer than the end of Sins of the Father. I thought that it would probably be about the same length, but it's going to be a little bit longer. There is one more chapter that I want to read before I finish today, and I'm going to go straight into it. Chapter 3. Sliding her psychic protection back into place, Martha determinedly shunned the dark, debasing energy that lingered around her, back to the ether where it could disturb her no longer. It went reluctantly, wanting to be felt, to be listened to, clawing at the edges of her mind, and happy to be so casually dismissed. Excuse me. That astute female officer had it right. It was disturbing, all of it. From the grisly remains of the demon that Martha had thought disposed of, the stubborn remnants of a monster that she'd made very dead, to all of the darkness that lingered on the summit of Blackthorn Hill, seeping out into the ether, poisoning the land in a way that it might never be able to recover from, no matter what the Nephilim and the forces of good did to try and repair it. The demons liked this tainted space. They were drawn to it, had fought for it with fierce determination, unlikely to let it remain within the Nephilim's protective hands for long without further bloodshed. More innocent lives would be sacrificed to this evil, feeding the corruption in a terrifying loop of darkness to the underlying terrifying threat that surely watched on, scrutinising Martha as its gruesome message was received, letting her know that her actions were being carefully monitored, likely by the Dark King himself. Returning to her feet, she offered the beleaguered hilltop her back, a way of physically distancing herself from what was down there, her eyes seeking out Stefan where he stood close to the tree line. As their eyes locked, his expression remained as blank as ever, but for some reason the lack of response made Martha feel like she'd failed him and his brothers terribly. Her impulsive, emotionally fraught reaction to her family's situation had brought the attention of their enemies down heavily upon them. She had blundered her way through this whole endeavour because it had been personal to her, and she refused to take no for an answer, to listen to any sort of reason that might make her slow down, refused to act with caution. She'd been blinded by her own need to make peace with her tortured past and ensure that her family suffered no longer for her sins. This was her fault. She'd been careless, This was her fault. She'd been careless, too quick to act. These things bothered her so much more than she liked, but what seemed to hit her the hardest in that moment was the distance that had been wrought between her and Stefan because of it. The contrast between having his voice in her head, talking to her, reading her thoughts and emotions as if they were their own, and now that blank, impenetrable stare struck so deep that Martha thought she might as well go down to that hillside, lay down next to the demon that she'd executed and confess all of her sins to the psychic police officer who deserved to have all of her wild theories about mystical malevolence proven true. Just end her right there and there. Get it over and done with. Ever since he'd taken her under his wide and human angelic wing, Stephen and Martha had been a cohesive unit, a force to be reckoned with in spite of their clashing natures. Standing there looking at him, Martha felt far adrift and very much alone, a feeling that only seemed to intensify as she realised that she was shortly going to have to say goodbye to him all over again. Once their business was concluded, she'd be going back across the border, getting on with the life that she demanded to reclaim for herself, while he'd remain exactly where he was stationed, on this side of the border, with his brothers, not with her. Another rash and emotionally charged decision that she'd recently made. Doing her best to quell the sudden rising tide of sorrow, Martha tried to find something positive to take away from the unfortunate incident, positing, Peter Maxwell has some sources inside of the constabulary. As of yet, they don't seem to have been able to identify the demon, and I would imagine that any physical evidence lingering to me would have been destroyed during the body's short stint through the divide. Still, I'll ask if he can make some inquiries, keep his ear to the ground for us in case that changes. Stephen appeared to agree, nodding. That seems wise. The demon didn't seem local to the area, though I guess it did share some similarities with my mum. Given the interest that their so-called king has shown, they were likely of the same brethren. I would concur with that assessment. Martha sighed and satisfied. I wish I knew who he was. Displaying his disapproval at hearing her doubt herself, Stephen certainly inquired, would identifying the demon change how you acted, Martha? Without hesitation, she admitted, no. Then identifying it now would be redundant. Approaching him, she pressed, but Stephen, don't you want to know why this body, out of all the demons that we've slain here, was returned? I know why, he answered stubbornly. It was your ties that brought us here, your actions that led to us being granted permission to stay. This kill was your kill, this victory yours. It is an intimidation tactic, Martha, employed by our enemies to unnerve you, make you pause. I do not presume to speak on your behalf, but as far as we're concerned, I have no intentions of giving that glorified excuse of a demon the satisfaction of thinking that his cheap, petty scare tactics are a threat to be taken seriously. Stephen didn't speak for her. Not anymore, but he was right. Of course he was, though it felt pretty arrogant of him to simply cast the looming shadow of the Dark King aside as if it were irrelevant. There was a reason that the master of all demons was universally feared. His mind games were real. Only the favoured son of Azazel could ever boast such conviction. They are no longer in control, he stated firmly, and they know it. Yes, they did. But Martha couldn't find it within herself to feel the same determination that Stephen externally exuded. She couldn't view what had transpired here as a sign that they were winning the fight, simply because their enemy had already resorted to trying to use scare tactics. It felt too sinister, and much too personal, aimed directly at her. Sensing her doubts, Stephen began to speak in a less stern tone, apparently trying to be supportive, as he decreed, You are brilliant, Martha. I know that because I trained you. You are ready. But operating in this cursed place carries many a harsh burden. You do not need to carry them alone. Martha knew that. At least it felt like she should have known it. But it was hard not to feel isolated, targeted by their enemies. Silence fell between the two of them, an uncomfortable long chasm that seemed to stretch out for an eternity, neither of them taking the risk to breach that gap further than they already had. Martha folded her arms directly in front of her chest, partly because she felt vulnerable, felt the deep need to physically try and hold herself together, because it was starting to get more and more blustery up on the hill. Even though the sky was clearing up remarkably, it felt like the weather was shifting as she stood there. There was a storm brewing in the atmosphere, making its harsh intentions known. Tiredness tugged at her edges, pleading with her to go home, jump into a hot shower, crawl into bed and sleep for the rest of the week. But her other professional obligations were still calling, still needed her attention. Another day. Stifling a large yawn, she asked Stephen, Was there anything else? He stared at her for such a long time, saying nothing at all, that Martha thought she was going to have to prompt him to maybe stop being so rude and obtuse, but then he curtly shook his head. No, there was nothing else. He turned away, beckoning her to follow him back into the thick barrage of trees that lined the area, which she did, with a thoroughly dejected sigh. Navigating the closeted terrain felt trickier for Martha than it seemed to be for Stefan, a human-born senses not quite nearly as attuned to the task at hand. The brush that surrounded them, filling in the narrow gaps between the trees, was extremely overgrown, leaving barely enough of a gap for them to push on through, ducking under branches and crunching God knows what underfoot. The change in the level of terrain was quite gradual, but it was clear that they were heading back down Blackthorn Hill, away from the summit and that awful scene that had been created up there, back towards safety. As adept as Martha had become at controlling her metaphysical skills, she knew that she might never get used to the twisted feeling of dark energy, the sheer corruption that demons were capable of, and it didn't help to think that she was almost definitely being watched. She'd been brought up here for a sick purpose, and the body on the hilltop was just the tip of the iceberg. It wasn't paranoia if the monsters were genuinely out to get you, and now traipsing back down the hill, Martha couldn't help but fear that she and Stefan had been lured into an ambush, that whoever had dumped the body on top of the hills had been waiting to see who came to view it, and would use the thick cover of the woodland to attack them. They were not safe out here. She didn't know why or what she was feeling exactly, but they weren't. On high alert, her hand instinctively edged towards the small of her back, where a trusty dagger lived in its customised sheath that had been designed specifically for her frame. If there was to be a fight, she'd take down as many of them with her as she could. She'd been trained by the best, stood now at his back, and she would defend him with her life if it came down to it. She would never ever let the monsters capture her alive again, and she would never ever let them hurt her or anybody that she loved. The only danger that dared threaten their safety come not from a demon, however, hiding in the hills, but in the form of tangled roots on the ground, one of which managed to somehow ensnare itself around her foot and caused her to stumble. Which would have been fine had she not tried to grasp the branches of a nearby bush to stop herself from falling into the dirt, and grabbed a handful of brutally sharp prickles that seemed to have been strategically placed to ruin her day and embarrass the living hell out of her. Given the split-second choice between physically stopping herself from squealing out in surprised pain, potentially giving away their position and bringing any potential demonic cavalry down and baying down on them, and staying upright on her feet, sparing her ankle from pain, survival instinct won out. Martha lurched forward, the prickles tearing the flesh of her palm, her ankle getting rather violently twisted. Fortunately, the reactions of her guide were much faster than she could ever hope to possess, and Stefan swiftly spun around and grabbed her firmly around the waist, saving her from hitting the ground like an ineffectual human who couldn't even successfully navigate her way back through some overgrown woodland without stumbling, managing to also severely wound her ample pride in the process. "I'm okay," Martha sputtered, her voice far, far too high-pitched. She held her arms up, hands redundantly hanging in the air as she was worried about what she might try to impulsively grab hold of next. Her heart pounded wildly in her chest, an injection of adrenaline sparked by the fall, engaging her flight or fight response, though, as she raised her eyes, the damn thing didn't stop racing. If her time away in Marytown had made her temporarily forget how physically imposing Nephilim male warriors could be when they were compared to human males, being up close and personal to one of their biggest and best was a jarring reminder that Martha hadn't been quite prepared for, even if it was Stefan, and she knew that she was safe, because it was Stefan, and he would never ever hurt her. She knew that, with all of her logical mind she knew it, and yet she found herself blinking up at him far too many times because she'd also forgotten quite how diamond-esque his Watcher of the Hunt-inherited eyes were, and the realisation was so startling that it clashed with the long-standing internal battle that she fought between her head and her survival instincts in a way that she didn't quite understand. Her mind went woefully blank. "Martha?" It appeared that he'd spoken to her, posed a question that he was waiting for an answer to. Again she blinked, nervously repeated, "I'm fine. I must have just misjudged my footing somehow, tripped over an exposed root. It's fine." His frown burrowed in the same way that it had earlier, his hard stare narrowing as if he didn't quite believe her and was perhaps wondering who this clumsy human standing before him was, and what awful thing that she'd done to the female Nephilim that he'd taken under his wing. How on earth she'd infiltrated his ranks. Feeling like such a disappointment, Martha extricated her besieged foot from the root that had ensnared it, grimacing slightly as it came loose again when she placed it down on the ground and tried putting her weight on it. A thing that Stefan immediately noticed, because of course he did. He still managed to courteously ask her, "Are you injured, Martha?" "I'm fine," she lied. "You can let go of me now." With his bloody, ridiculously oversized hands still firmly clasped around her waist, Stefan continued to question her capabilities. "Can you stand?" "Yes," she insisted, though her legs felt kind of shaky. She rolled her foot, mentally assessing the damage that had been done. The twinge was immediate, but it was more like a dull ache than a painful stab. She was fairly certain that she hadn't done anything as stupid as to fracture it. It was merely twisted, slightly bruised like her ego. She would cope. She would have to. Stefan continued to pester her, asking her, "Will you be able to walk on it?" She scoffed. "Of course. I could carry you. Quite unnecessary." The sparkly eyes of his narrowed. He still didn't believe her, but he ceded to her stubbornness, released his hold on her. Sadly, that wasn't the end of the matter, as he sternly demanded, "Your hand." Confused, Martha frowned up at him. "What?" "Show me your hand." Trying to physically shake the injury off, she tried to assure him that she didn't need any more help than he'd already instinctively offered to her, swooping in to rescue her like some sort of bloody superhero. "It's fine, too. I shall be the judge of that. Show it to me." With a forlorn sigh, she protested, "Stefan, you don't have to." "Your hand, Martha. I will not ask you again." His unrelenting tone, stare, and whole demeanour made it clear that he wasn't going to allow it to brush him off. And as tempting as it was to stand her ground and assert her autonomy, a wave of tiredness that was somewhat disheartening washed over Martha's whole body. There were times and places for displays of her independence. This was not necessarily it. She offered up her injured hand for Stefan's discerning perusal. Steadying it with his own much larger hand, because frankly it was shaking far more than either of them seemed to be happy with, Stefan made a noise that sounded like a wincing hiss, and then he pulled out what appeared to be a dark handkerchief from the pocket of his bulky coat, shaking it out and pressing it firmly against the deep red slash that intersected her palm. In spite of herself, Martha flinched, cursed under her breath, which earned her a raised eyebrow. Rather than verbally chastising her for swearing as he normally might do, Stefan offered, "We've set up camp nearby. I could escort you there, take a look at your ankle and patch this up for you. It's not bleeding much, but I'd be a lot happier if you permitted me to disinfect and clean it." Shaking her head, she protested, "You don't need to do that." It would not be a burden. As tempting as it was to take up the offer, if only to see where the sons of Azazel had chosen to lay their heads, Martha insisted no. "I've been out in these woods long enough for one morning. I have other things to do." Stefan nodded. "Then I shall see you back to town. Hold on to me." "God, no," she exclaimed before catching herself curbing the blatant blasphemy. "I mean, thank you for the offer, Stefan, but I'm sure I can hike down the rest of this damn hill on my own 2 feet, and there's no need for both of us to risk crossing the border. Not this morning. Thank you." Though she knew he could see the logic in her rejection, Stefan still somehow managed to look like he was disappointed, poised to disagree, insist otherwise, which made Martha feel rather sorry for him. He was feeling the distance between them as much as she had, and he only wanted to help, make sure that she wasn't injured and didn't injure herself further out of stubbornness. She wished that she had it within her to placate him. It wasn't easy being empathic, and she understood that he was probably sensing her increased frustration and tiredness, her fears and her worries about what had been found on the hill. She'd been the one who had chosen the path that they now separately walked, the one responsible for all of this, and he wanted to be able to show her that he was still there. That was sweet, uncharacteristically so. But she needed to be a big girl and carry on, make her own way, on her own 2 clumsy feet. However deeply it ached to reject his offer for help. "I'm fine, Stefan," she preemptively interjected. "Please, just let's go." Without another word, he expertly fixed his handkerchief securely around her hand, bound across the lower part of her fingers and wrists bound across the lower part of her fingers and wrist, over her palm with an adept twisting knot, as if he'd used it before to dress a wound, and then he turned away from her, restarted their trek down the hill. Martha let him go without a word, granted him the respect to be the one who walked away this time. Deserved, though it felt bittersweet. He'd sacrificed so much for her. None of this had been Stefan's choice. From her hastily demanded request to return home and check in with her sister, to the decision to send the elite squadron of Nephilim warriors who would claim the border to support her and cover her movements, and the decision for them to part ways after a decade together. Right from the start, he'd always put his personal feelings aside and put himself in danger, waiting for her to conclude her business here in the demon-infested hills. And then, when she'd raced back to where he'd waited, armed with an even wilder plan to protect her mother from what had befallen her, he'd again conceded to her demands, backed her up, saved her mother's life. Stephen had brought the best of his warrior brothers down to bear on the monsters that held the town captive, and he'd been nothing but proud of Martha for how it had all felt out. This felt like the least that she could do. Following after him, Martha focused on where she was putting her feet, watching out avidly for any other demonic tree roots that might start heading in her direction, eager to injure her further. For his part, Stephen appeared to be using his bulky frame to create a wider, distinct path for her to fit through, easing some of the burdens. It was a subtle but noticeable shift. Good thing she wasn't too proud to accept such assistance, trusting him to watch out for potential dangers in the woods. The remainder of the walk down the hill was uneventful. Allowing herself to relax, Martha continued to move slow and extra carefully, trying her best to remain upright. Navigate the treacherous route with no further injuries other than a stinging ankle, one badly bruised ego, and what seemed to be a bit of a bump in her and Stephen's relationship. Hard to say what caused her the most pain. When the trees eventually cleared, they emerged at the side of a long winding road that connected Blackthorn to Marytown. It was such relief to finally be free of the woods that Martha paused for a moment and unleashed the bated breath that she'd been holding. An even greater relief to see the public house that she and Stephen utilised as a neutral meeting point nestled into the landscape. The Blackthorn Arm was not somewhere Martha had ever felt inclined to visit before her abduction. Now it felt like a port in the impending raging storm, a safe harbour, somewhere significant, even though her most recent visit had been fraught with emotion. That morning she was relieved to see the building. That morning she was relieved to see that the building had not yet opened for the day, sat in serene darkness with all of its doors, windows and even curtains sealed up, nice and safe. The car park was also empty, thankfully not being used as a staging area for the constabulary to get their people up and down the hill. A stark reprieve from the stress of hiding away behind Nephilim trickery and praying not to get spotted by those who would undeniably question what they were doing out there. As they traversed it, Martha didn't feel like she was ready to invoke a repeat performance of what had happened the day that she'd last been here, an emotional, drawn-out goodbye. Instead, also casually asking Stephen if he wouldn't mind, "Will you walk on a little bit further with me this morning?" Some of the tension that he'd been carrying visibly eased from his shoulders, and he nodded, either considerate or stubborn enough not to inquire about her ankle, though he surreptitiously glanced down at him. "It's nothing I can't walk off," she assured him, trying not to limp. The reality was it was a minor injury. She would heal quick enough. It wasn't going to throw her off her game for too long. Seemingly placated, Stephen remained with her until they were far enough down the road that the horrific scene at the top of Blackthorn Hill was an unhappy memory, edging closer to the boundary that had once been heavily monitored by demonic vanguards. Now the area in which they walked was in the hands of the Nephilim. There was little to no chance of them being seen by their enemy there. But if the morning's disturbing revelations had served to teach Martha a lesson, it was to not take such things for granted. You can never be too certain, and she didn't want to risk Stephen. A lesson proved when she began to sense that they were not alone, a grouping of pulsing energy signatures edging into her periphery of her mental radar. It wasn't an ambush, not a pack of wild demons that she'd be forced to fight if she wanted to make it over the border and back home safely and unobserved. No, they were friendly, allies. Though she'd never be able to pinpoint their precise location with her eyes unless they allowed her to do so, Martha recognised them as if they were an extension of herself and the male that she walked by the side of, because that was precisely what they were, the Nephilim, sons of Azazel, kin. Through a bond with Stephen, all the Nephilim warriors in the area were like family to her. She doubted that they would ever view her in the same light, given that she was human-born, but she felt equally relieved and pleased to sense them nearby, clearly moving into the area to offer support to the usual contingent of guards who'd be manning and patrolling this section of Marytown's border, because they were the cream of the Nephilim crop. Stephen's sentinels, his best warriors, his protectors. Not that the impressive favoured son never needed much protecting. Still, it was good to know that they were there, watching over him, taking the increased risk that his presence so close to the border might pose seriously. Like it or not, as far as the demons were concerned, Stephen was a high-value target. Taking him out would cripple the Nephilim's operations here, not to mention what it would do for morale. Martha couldn't even bring herself to contemplate the effect that it might have upon her, even in the hypothetical. There were moments when she was given a stark reminder of who the male Nephilim that she was bonded with was, and how important he was to their father's war with the demons, how vital a role he played. Such recklessness it had been to drag him out there on a whim, because she was feeling lonely and didn't want to have to say goodbye too quickly. Stopping shy of where the much-lit fought-over border lay, she turned to face him, didn't quite know what to say. Thank yous didn't seem nearly enough to express everything she was feeling, and knowing his brothers were nearby, and that he wouldn't appreciate her making a scene out of their parting, nothing more meaningful felt quite appropriate. The relationship had never involved displays of affection, so she'd learned many ways to show him that she cared, but nothing came to mind that morning. Meekly she began to offer him something, anything. "Stefan," she said. He interrupted her, eyes locked resentfully over the top of her head on what lay ahead of them, the path that would take her from his side again. Rather gruffly he muttered, "I despise this whole place." Martha sealed her lips, nodded once, and simply listened. "I hate everything about it," he continued, "everything that it stands for." "I know," she said softly, supportively. Still glaring bitterly at the road that curled off into the distance, flanked by woodland, as if it revolted him simply by having the nerve to be there, he unleashed a new grunt of annoyance and continued his rant, seeming not to care if their conversation was being eavesdropped on by those who were faithfully guarding him from the ether, eager to get it all off his chest. "It galls me that you are over there, across this damnable border, while I'm stranded over here, unable to help you as I should. Wasting my time." "You're not wasting your time, Stefan," she attempted to reassure him. "I understand your frustration. The past weeks. It's been an adjustment. But what you're doing out here is vital. It might not seem like it, but it helps me knowing that you're here, even if we're not in contact." Meeting her eyes, he sounded somewhat surprised. "It does?" "Of course," she swore implicitly. "There's no way in hell I could have shown my face in Marytown to help my sister if it hadn't been for you. There's no way I could have protected my mother, gotten her away from that house. If you hadn't been there to rescue her, you saved her life." His big shoulders made an almost imperceptible shrug, as if he couldn't quite believe the assertion, and he attempted to brush it off by artfully using her opening statement to shift the subject, saying, "Gail is doing much better, I hear. Though it's been noted that you have yet to make any arrangements to go and visit with her on the Mount." Martha fought the urge to roll her eyes. She knew that Stefan would try to do everything within his power to bring her and her biological father close together, but the current state of her rapidly extending family wasn't something she wanted to debate, especially not there, when they were not alone. There was a certain irony to what had transpired after William Ford was murdered, snatched from his family by a monster that hadn't cared about the sanctity of human life. On returning to Marytown, Martha had pleaded with Stefan to take her catatonic, ailing mother to Gadriel on the Mount, where she was given the best medical care and mystical treatments that she could have ever dreamed of. It had never crossed Martha's mind that upon waking her beloved mother might choose not to return to Marytown, but instead shack up with the fallen angel who'd once left her high, dry and pregnant some 30 years previously. Yet that is precisely what Gail had chosen to do, leaving her daughters behind in Marytown without her presence. Martha couldn't bring herself to blame her mother for not coming back to the house that her husband was murdered in, even though the additional feeling of loss had hit Amanda extremely hard. There had been a day over a decade ago when she'd been faced with the same crossroads, forced to decide whether she'd return somewhere that had once been her home and try to reclaim her life, surrounded by memories of what had been before it was cruelly snatched away from her, or forge a new path for herself. Destiny sometimes forced you to make harsh choices, and whatever you decided, you have to live with the aftermath of them. The burden of accountability for sending her mother up to the haven upon the Mount fell heavily on Martha's shoulders, but it was truly Gail's choice, because it was her life, her path to walk. Her daughters didn't have to approve, but she was living a life for herself now, by the side of the male that she loved, a male Martha still struggled to accept. Sighing, she confessed to Stefan, "I don't think I'm ready for that. You shall have to face seeing them sooner or later. I know, but not yet, not with everything else that's going on." Wisely, Stefan let the matter go. The customs in which he had been raised proclaimed that the Watchers of the Mount were above all others and should be respected as such. Nephilim males placed their fathers on a pedestal and revered their mothers for the contribution that they had made to the race. For without the archaic sons of gods and the daughters of man, there would be no Nephilim to quell the spread of the demons. But it wasn't equal. The union of Gael and Gadriel would have been celebrated had Martha been born male, and conceived anywhere but within the border of Marytown. She would have been accepted, Gael revered and eternally cared for. Instead, she'd been an anomaly, human-born, a forgotten one. Her birth was uncelebrated, her beloved mother shunned. As far as Martha was concerned, this was all happening 30 years too late, and though she was happy for her mother for taking what happiness she was able to find, it would take time for her to put aside the hurts of the past and embrace the hypocrisy of it. From where she came from, matters of the family were not so strict. Her family were those that she loved, and people who loved her in return. And she'd never wanted a father, let alone one that was like Gadriel. Swiftly switching the conversation from her issues and back onto her company, she smiled and stated, "You're a good male, Stephen." He bowed his head. "I appreciate you saying that, Martha. You know, for all that you've done, I'll never be able to repay you." Seemingly mortified by the suggestion, he said, "Unnecessary." "I know, but I mean it. You've given me back so much, and I'm not simply talking about this probably naive attempt at recreating a life for myself, being reconciled with my family and other people that I love. You made all this possible, gave me the skills that I need to survive this place, the opportunity to finally make this town somewhere my mother can be proud to say that I come from. My support is not a waste of your time, Stephen. Not to me." Deflated and visibly wearied, he released a breath which felt like it carried more than he likely felt able to say, another silence falling between the two of them. Martha wished that she'd let him show her back to the camp that the Nephilim had set up in the area. Not because her ankle still throbbed and her hand was still stinging, simply so that they could have had this conversation somewhere safer, in privacy, if only to allow Stephen the freedom to be able to express himself more openly, a thing that she knew he so often struggled to do. She should have been more understanding and much more tactful. It didn't matter much if she agreed wholeheartedly with his dislike of the sprawling, superficially serene town and all that it stood for, or with his displeasure at the two of them being forced apart simply because of an old irrelevant pact stated that they were meant to stay away from Marytown. Stephen North had a vital role to play in whatever was to come, one that required him to be the leader his father entrusted him to be, the warrior that his brothers needed him to be, and the Nephilim male that he would always be. So I lost myself there for a second. Martha needed him. She believed in him. She believed in their mission. She also knew that she wasn't going to be able to succeed on her own. The sons of Azazel might have operated it beyond the border of the town, in a seemingly endless clash with the darkness that once guarded it. They might well have been feeling the same way their leader felt, frustrated behind enemy lines, but Martha was going to need them as much as Stephen. As isolated as she might have been feeling, she wasn't alone, and neither were they. They were all in this fight together. Feeling encouraged, she decided that it was finally time to part ways, making Stephen promise to contact her immediately if any other unusual occurrences happened on his side of the border. Something he seemed happy to oblige her with, seeking his assurance that she would call him if she needed his assistance with anything at all, anything, it didn't matter how small. Raising the hood of her fleece sweatshirt, Martha left Stephen and his band of warrior brothers behind, swiftly heading back up the road that he vehemently disliked, crossing the border back into the town that he disliked to the home that she was trying to reclaim, with a limp, a field-bandaged hand and a renewed sense of purpose, the drive to move things along. If you're fortunate, destiny grants you the presence of people who make your life easier to navigate, people who'll be there whenever you need them to be, with no questions asked and no strings attached to their offers of kindness, because no matter where life decides to take you, no matter how trivial the ask or how intense the obstacles that threaten to tear you asunder, the bond you share with them is powerful, can make you believe that the fight is worth fighting. Martha knew that she had plenty of support, the approval of the Watchers of the Mount, the might of the Nephilim forces at her back should she need them. She had a team of talented humans who specialised in counteracting the darkness that had long corrupted Marytown, friends, allies, and she had her family, her wonderful sister. All she needed now was an opportunity, a foothold, a way to begin. The monsters thought that they could intimidate her, scare her off, and stop her from finishing what she'd started. They thought wrong. Marytown was going to be free. Martha Valentine would ensure it. Okay, so that was longer than I thought it was going to be. I had in my idea, I was like, I'm going to read the first 3 chapters. I'm going to, out of the 4 perspectives that are in the book, I'm going to get the first 2 out of the way. Most importantly, Martha, and give you a sense of where she's at and what she's been up to in the short amount of time that's passed since the first book ended and this one began. And yeah, that took a lot longer to read than I was planning to, which is actually good, because it lends into the thought that I had that it will mostly be like 1 chapter at a time, because they are so long and a lot more involved. Yeah, I'm going to have to get used to the flow of things again and get into it. So yeah, 3 chapters down, introduced 2 of the perspectives that this book will be coming in. One is Martha, one is a very different perspective that I'm not going to say too much about at this point. Setting up part of what the story is going to be about, and what it's going to be involved, and the potential consequences to come of what went before. So yeah, gosh, this is going to be a big task reading this book. I can feel it already. It's going to be a tricky one, and it's going to be a big task, and it's probably going to take about 50 million years. So I hope that you come back for more Hell Hath No Fury, first part of Art of War. And yeah, please leave me your feedback. Feel free to get in touch with me. My author's Twitter account is @LucieJMansell. I'll put it in the description so that you get the spelling and everything right. And I will see you in the next video. Thank you so much for watching, and bye.